Welcome to Play the Man Podcast, a podcast seeking to build sturdy men in a wobbly world.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Play the Man Podcast. Today we've got Pastor Shane Pennington and Pastor Peter Johnson with us, and I'm Zach Fink. Today we want to talk a little bit about just the state of the Evangelical Church. It's the beginning of 2025. And we thought it'd be helpful to ruminate about maybe some things that might be coming down the road and maybe some things we've observed recently about evangelicalism at large. So to kind of kick us off here, do either of you guys have any interesting observations coming at the end of 2024 for the church broadly?
I think it's weird just to hear you say 2025.
I know.
I'm already freaked out by that.
I know. It's here.
It's here.
It's here.
I don't know. I might just start with the fact that I think it's interesting because we had an election in November and soon to have an inauguration. And I feel like the vibe, the feel is probably very different than it would have been depending on how the election went. I think there's cautious optimism in the church, and I think we could get into some of the things maybe the election is seen as repudiating and why that might be optimistic for the church, but then why there should be maybe some caution going into that. But I think a lot of what I would think of, some would flow out kind of just where we are as a nation, and I think we kind of got a pulse on the nation in November of how people are thinking, and I think some of that was pretty encouraging.
Do you think in hindsight, a lot of people acted like in hindsight that the results played out the way everyone planned on them playing out a little bit, but I reminded some other folks, I don't know that it felt like it was so certain. But when you look at the numbers, it was a landslide, if you look at it.
Yeah, it's just weird that landslides are like 51% in U.S. politics, right? It was a landslide, but when you still look at the popular vote, it wasn't. There's still a good majority of people that think a different way. But
yeah, landslide in that he really owned the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Right.
And he owned the popular vote. And it's just,
like
both were just checkmates. But it wasn't, 62 to, 28 or something like that.
You're right. Yeah. But I do think you're right in that I think there were people who thought maybe there was sort of a landslide coming. But I just don't think anybody could trust anything. Nobody knew what to believe about the polls.
Which is another
nobody
interesting aspect, isn't it? Because you we're losing trust in institutions. I think that's objective. You can't deny that. And so if you're losing trust in trusted institutions,
right,
where then do you place your trust? What then do you do with this sense of angst and anxiety? If you're not a Christian, it's not human nature. You want to cling to something that's certain, that's true. You can hold it and say this is objective.
Yeah. And I don't think nobody could have predicted, I don't think, or nobody I was talking to was predicting or listening to, that we would have an election and not have social upheaval, much less something resembling a civil war.
Yeah.
And I think all of us thought, we don't know if the election is going to be fair and free, and even if it is, it's going to be ugly. Yeah. Like, the fallout's going to be ugly at some level. And the fact that it was just, it kind of happened and everybody accepted it and moved on was something I could not have predicted. But,
Yeah, I agree. I feel like something to call out specifically is the mainstream media, I feel like, caused a lot of angst here. A lot of unnecessary turmoil to this whole thing. Like, this is going to cause an uproar. How it's a kind of a fear-mongering attitude and position to say it did feel that way and nothing happened, because most Americans just want their lives to go on the way they're going on currently.
Right.
So they really don't want something like that to happen. But 2 days after the election and the results were done, there was just a complete shift in the mainstream media away from slamming whatever Trump-related thing was going on to just regular news. It happened in an instant. Like they turned a feed off. And it was across all the publications, minus a few conservative ones. That seems like someone was lying. It's
massive layoffs.
yeah, I mean, all sorts of things. So, I don't know. It feels indicative, and it feels like that's a signal in itself.
Yeah.
You know?
I think one of the things I feel like has changed almost overnight post-election that I think is a positive sign for the church because it had so infected the church, and that was wokeism, critical race theory, DEI, whatever labels you want to put on it, seemed to kind of fall out of vogue almost immediately. I mean, it seemed like it was overnight that it was like it was cool to just to use words like meritocracy again. You know what I mean? It's like so when I think about the state of the church and the state of evangelicalism, because that had so infiltrated evangelicalism, I think that's an encouraging sign to see that change so quickly.
Yeah, and I think if we were to look, at the 50,000 foot level, there's a lot of things going on, right? So sometimes we focus on one issue, but I think it's safe to say in America, I think in my lifetime, whether you call it cultural Christianity or whatever, that is in decline, right? I mean, people used to be embarrassed not to say they were a Christian, even when they really weren't, right? Because so there's been that there has been a decline, but I'm very skeptical of like surveys that go out, reports. I'm just doing some last minute reading before I got here, and I'm just like garbage. It's why is the church in decline? Because we're not socially, we're not looking at the social cues and changing with them. Well, that's not the role of the church to change with culture, right? But I think growing up, like post high school, college, around that time frame, I mean, the big thing was the mega churches.
Yeah.
And the thing was the church of the youth. That's where they were going. The hip church, that wasn't even a name in the 80s and early 90s, but, Saddleback was doing pretty good. Willow Creek, those were the churches in the know, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying they aren't a factor today, but they're losing their gas. Something's changing. I look at my own kids now, who are now older than I was, except for Bethany. Bethany's in college. Mm-hmm. What churches are they looking for? What do they find meaningful? Having grown up in the church, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the mega church. It's not the contemporary church. Where are all their friends going? They're going to churches like Anglican, Missouri Synod Lutheran. They're going to more liturgical churches, more of a higher form of worship. And I know this is totally anecdotal, but I ask them why. They're looking for something sacred. They're looking for something that is transcendent. They're looking for something that is, it lifts them upward in their focus. They're not interested in the rock concert, the skinny jeans, and the peace out, let's meet next week type thing. They're going deeper.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Why do you think?
I think they've identified something that at best is hollow and at worst is bankrupt. I think we could kind of get off the topic here and just say, what is biblical worship? But when you change that whole dynamic and say the whole purpose of church is for that one person that might come to Christ today, Sunday morning, and so we gear the whole liturgy, the order of worship, not to be offensive to unbelievers. We've done something to the church that we've made it earthy. We've made it benign, and I think people want something that lifts them higher. Mm-hmm. There is an experience in worship that people want, and I don't just mean it's experiential, but I mean that's part of worship in its grand design. Is to the first day of the week as we gather, we are reminded, we are relifted, we are reinvigorated in our faith as we worship the Holy God.
So 2025 prediction is growth of small liturgical churches?
I think there is a decline, but I think the decline is, if a secular journalist just says, hey, I want to do a project on the church today. Well, yeah, if you look at the main line, they are in decline. Let's name names, right? If you look at almost any PCUSA church, and the sort of the tragedy is they're beautiful buildings, but they're hollow. They're a whitewashed tomb. There's probably 20 people in there, all over 78, right? And it's dead spiritually. But I just talk about heavenly. My mind just. What was your question? I just lost my old train of thought.
No, I said I'm putting the money where your mouth is on this was 2025 predictions.
2025 prediction
and beyond.
I think keep on track, Pete. I think 2025. Yeah, we're going to see. Here's what I'm saying: are we in decline as a church, or are we divided? And I don't mean divided in a divisive sense. But where are all the mega church people going? It's dividing. I think they're going elsewhere. They're going to different churches that they've never been to before. So what's happening? Protestants are going Catholic. Protestants are going Orthodox. Southern Baptists are becoming Anglican. Non-denominational are like, okay, we haven't bought the whole ball of wax, but we're going to a Presbyterian church. I think you're going to see more of that.
Yeah.
And one article I read, which is pretty interesting, it said, although the church in America is in decline, the major force of Christianity in America, prediction, right? I don't know if this is 2025, but that and beyond, was that the predominant faith, although a minority, the predominant will be conservative Christianity.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is, the churches that survive are conservative in their doctrine. They're biblical, let's say, right?
Yeah.
And I think we see these trends and we make predictions.
Yeah.
Fosdick made a prediction, and his prediction, going to Machen, his prediction was, look, if the churches don't change, they're gonna die. Well, look what's happening to the churches that he said we need to be in order to survive. It's those churches that are dying. The mainline liberal denominations that Fosdick promoted are dying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The churches that Machen, that doesn't mean just the OPC, but conservative biblical churches are the ones that are either maintaining their numbers or increasing.
Yeah. Yeah. It probably has to do with some of the neutrality in this space in general going away, where I feel like Christianity is neutral. There's a whole middle section to go after, right? Because it can be cool to go and not know what's going on, right? You can be a mega church and you can have a large attraction if it's neutral, but if it's not received as neutral and it's either positive or negative to somebody, then you have to make a choice. Mm-hmm. A mega church isn't really necessarily a choice for everybody. Maybe you're just going, maybe that's where your parents go, maybe that's something that just culturally you grew up with and you're going to go to that thing. But it feels a little more, it's less neutral if you say you're going to this conservative Christian church, because there's a different level of accountability built into that usually. Right. It's not a neutral way to look at your religion at all. Right. Whereas I think you can go for 1 hour, you can do praise and worship for 25 minutes and, a short message, and then you can say hi and bye. And that's okay too, but I'm just saying that's a fairly neutral experience for the most part. Mm-hmm. And the accountability may or may not be there. It depends on if you choose to do a small group or not. But you can not be noticed coming and going.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting what you said about maybe being numerically smaller, but potentially more potent.
Yeah.
I think that's something we're going to see for maybe decades
Right.
with the church, but to me is more exciting, And I think of when I was a Southern Baptist, and the Southern Baptist Convention being probably 10 times as large as the PCA. Mm-hmm. But in the public sphere, you wouldn't know that. The PCA always felt like just as large of a denomination because of how they influenced the culture, how they spoke, how they wrote, right? They punched way above their weight class.
Right.
Because they were potent
Right.
as a denomination. Mm-hmm. And I think that's hopefully kind of a model for what Christianity and evangelicalism is going to become, is something that even though we may decrease in size, we become more potent, punch above our weight class, and are able to actually help shape, evangelize our culture. So
yeah,
that's an exciting prospect.
Yeah. What else are we looking forward to coming off of 2024 into 2025? What are some other areas in the church that feel like they're maybe shifting a little bit? I mean, what you just talked about was a pretty big one, but other areas.
I think, there's like I said, at the 50,000 foot level, there's a lot of factors, right? This isn't just monolithic, but I think another one we're seeing people that are willing to move across country for a church they want to belong to. Mm-hmm. And it's not just a church building where they mark off on their calendar, went to church today. But I think what's distinct that I haven't seen in my lifetime is this really true desire to be part of a Christian community that is real, and people want to come together and worship with other believers, that their faith is the most important thing in their life. At least that's the aspiration, right? We struggle with that, but they don't want to just attend church from 10:30 to 11:30, mark it off their calendar, and next week they do the same thing. They want to live the Christian life. They want to be in Christian community. And I think that goes to what Shane was saying, where that, it might be lower in numbers, but it's concentrated, right? Mm. The faith is concentrated. The impact is concentrated. The church in America might be smaller as a whole, but it's delivering slugs that are above its weight class.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It feels like a refining process when you say it that way.
Yeah. And, there's always ebbs and flows. One point in time with climate, there used to be an ice age. Well, we're not in an ice age anymore. One point in time, you look at the nation of Israel, there's times of apostasy and idolatry, and there's times of growth. We look at the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening, moments of desert wilderness experience, but then faith reemerges. I think there are many factors with the neo-atheist, but there's a point where that just becomes bankrupt. Filling the mind with knowledge alone doesn't satisfy.
Yeah.
In fact, it can even create depression of, you think of guys like some of the early atheists. What's his name? It'll come to me. You're in despair.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or the other direction is you want to seek something transcendent. Yep. You're looking for truth. Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? How did this Sitka spruce get so big and awesome and beautiful from a little seed? What's really going on in this process of photosynthesis? It's all a cosmic accident. No, it's someone created this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's something we've talked about is, it seems like materialism and the place science once held, and science in the sense of, the approved science, where we live in this closed universe where everything's materialistic and, there is no transcendent, there is no supernatural, any of that. That's starting to crumble. People say trust the science. I don't think there's a lot of people who trust the science anymore.
Right.
And we've talked about some anecdotal things we've seen in our own lives, but just seeing how many people today are looking for the transcendent, people who have rejected materialism for something beyond that, who believe in the supernatural, who believe in an afterlife, those kinds of things. That's all potentially exciting for the church. I think it's potentially scary too if those people don't receive the gospel, if they don't find what they're looking for in Christ, they're going to find it in other areas, and that I think makes it all the more challenging for the church. But those are some interesting trends. I think we can all look around and go, yeah, I mean, this isn't. We're not living in modernity anymore, or in the Enlightenment. We're living in something very different, and that is new challenges and new opportunities for the church.
Yeah, and I think part of those new opportunities that come in 2025 is going to be a harvest field that's white and ready to be harvested.
Yeah.
I was listening to an interview Tucker Carlson had with a journalist that grew up as a Mennonite in Los Angeles. Well, he grew up elsewhere, moved to Los Angeles, became a far left progressive, kind of left his faith, entered the Malibu Pacific Palisades life, got all into that, had a house up there, and he's being interviewed by Tucker Carlson, talking about the fire, but talking about life there in Los Angeles. And he said, it's just empty.
Yeah.
They've lost everything, but then there's this sense of, well, they haven't lost everything because they got huge bank accounts, right? But they lost the home that they loved, right? Yeah. And there's all the finger pointing and blaming. How did this happen? Was it DEI? Was it incompetence? Was it God's judgment? Certainly couldn't be that. But he says, this is what I thought interesting. Then he started talking like, I think this guy is a Christian, because he talked about this guilt culture that we have that's been indoctrinated by Christianity. And people are trying to address their own guilt. But the way they've learned to do that is through this virtue signaling.
Right. Yeah, right.
So this is the new atonement. So the symptom is there, right? They're misguided and they're misdirected. But the symptom is, how do I deal with my guilt? And I thought, that's interesting.
Yeah.
How does guilt come out of a fire that destroys Malibu and Pacific Palisades and Eaton Canyon and this life of Southern California? I think people face a crisis and then they're able to see anew the vanity of it all.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Without sounding too deep and philosophical.
And I think on that, with kind of going back to the first thing with the destruction of seeing wokeism crumble, DEI crumble, seeing all these things crumble. What's crumbling with it, I think, is victimhood and blame shifting and these kinds of things. And I think something that's encouraging, I feel like we're on the very front of it, is people taking personal responsibility.
Yes.
For their own actions, for their own emotions.
And that's exactly where they went. That's
and you're starting to see that now where it's like, I could point my fingers at Gavin Newsom, but I chose to live here.
Right.
I voted blue. Whatever, right?
Yeah,
there's a point where I got to come back and take personal responsibility, start with me, and control what I can control. And I feel like we've been infected with this idea of it's someone else's fault, and it's always out there, and that never helps get anything accomplished. And so, so I hope even in that, as people approach spiritual matters and things like that, of judgment begins with the household of God, and responsibility begins with me, and I have to start with my own heart and my own sin and those kinds of things. I think that's something that's refreshing and maybe an opportunity we have in 2025.
Yeah. I hope we see, and I think we will. And we might even start seeing a trend now with public intellectuals. Right? I think we've mentioned Jordan Peterson and how he seems to wrestle, and maybe the Spirit's calling him. I read an article about one of my favorite authors the other day. His name's Matthew Crawford, and he wrote a book that was pretty popular over a decade ago called Shop Craft as Soulcraft. And he worked at a think tank for a while. He hated the type of work it was. He actually, I guess he works on motorcycles. He loves the tactile nature of that kind of work and stuff. But he's an intellectual, right? He writes philosophical books, and they're great. They're really excellent. And at the end of 2024, he publicly told people he converted to Anglicanism. And I wouldn't have put him on a list of people that I would think would convert, because he didn't say he was above any of that. He's a very grounded individual, but probably is what I assumed, right? That as a public, I would think of him as kind of a public intellectual. I think he's written 3 or 4 books. Great thinker, great writer, very challenging, but definitely not Christian, definitely not religious. And I think that there should be more, right? And I think if we're heading into this whatever this new phase is, I think maybe not a post-science phase, but if we're done just believing consensus science, as fact in everything, then people are gonna have to wrestle with some of the harder questions, all over the place, intellectuals included. And those intellectuals, they carry weight, right? Yeah. I mean, he's a celebrated author. I celebrate him by telling people to read his books, right? But I never would have thought he would be on a list of a convert, for example, right? I think that's really neat, and I think that the Spirit should bring a few other folks around here and help pave some of those conversations, right? Because I've always thought of public intellectuals as maybe some of the hardest folks to talk to, because they got an answer for all of it, right? So when I see like one of our guys, like an Oz Guinness debate with somebody, I'm just like, yeah, man, that takes skill, right? That takes, really thoughtful engagement with this other guy. But if everyone's wrestling with it on the inside, I think that's healthy, right? And if it's not, maybe it's not cool, but let's just say you're not getting shunned or canceled right off the bat because you say you believe in God. That's helpful also for the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think as Christians we have an edge in engaging the world, and that edge is, let me segue a bit in that, this whole aspect of you can identify as a woman when you're a man, you can identify as a man when you're a woman, but that's not how you were made, And these people that transition and say, if my life as a woman now, if I could only become a man, then I'd be complete. But they enter a man's world and they realize it's hard. The point that I'm making is they weren't made for that, right? I go fly fishing sometimes. I remember looking down and I'm seeing all these trout in this crystal cold stream, and I'm fishing, and I love to swim, and I was swimming in there later on, and I love to swim. I'm a good swimmer, but I'm not made for this.
Right.
If left to this, I would die. And the point that I'm making is, even if people don't realize that they're made for it, something internally has to resonate with it. You were made to worship. You're worshiping the world, or you're worshiping something in it, but you will find that will not satisfy. And the only thing that will satisfy is Christ. And you resist that, you argue against it, you deny it verbally, but you can't deny it internally. Something will resonate with that.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you can't have a heart of stone, but those words will chisel that heart of stone.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious what you guys think of, if you look out, and we've talked about some of the things maybe that are encouraging some of the shifts. Have you seen anything that maybe has you worried, discouraged about 2025, where we're heading, where things are moving?
I think what Pastor Peter was just talking about, that people finding that hole, that the internal thing that's humbling us somewhere, or shaming us from somewhere, or telling us that something's missing, people are going to find ways to fill that hole. Yeah. And if they go dogmatic on a religion that's a higher plane, that might be tricky, right? It might be trickier than talking to an atheist. Atheists are not that bad. They're just like, I don't believe in God. And you're like, really? Like, there's a lot of ways to tackle that question. And there's a lot of logical ways. There's presuppositional ways. There's evidential ways. There's like a lot of ways to talk to them. But like, I have not met a Mormon personally that used to be in the Mormon church. Like, I have several friends that used to be in the Mormon church. They're not interested in a religion at all. Yeah. At any level. Because that was the one thing that they trusted, and whatever failed there, if it was something internally or something in their family or whatever, it has crushed their spirit in believing that another religion can. I mean, I wouldn't say they're agnostic, because I don't even think they think of it that way. I think
But
just
you
like,
bring it up, it's like, hey, I've been there. I've experienced.
already
that.
tried
Thanks,
that.
but no, yeah,
it's not a
thanks,
thing.
but no thanks. Yeah.
You're right, and it's okay that they're wrestling, but I don't even know if they're wrestling. It just feels like they shot that shot, and that's just not a path now.
Yeah.
And I think that could be, those types of things could be tricky because you go into a church. This happens in our church, not our church body necessarily locally. I'm just saying generally, people go into the church with expectations about how this void will get filled, and the Spirit will work on us the way it works on us. And it might be you run into a few hypocrites in that church and become friends with them, and then find out you're just a sinner like me. You're like, yeah, that's fine. And you're like, oh, I didn't know that was fine. And I'm not down for that. You know, I thought you actually were in a better moral position than I was. And I just heard you blah, 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 or saw you whatever. And you're like, it was a mistake or it wasn't a mistake. Let me explain it. People can go into something emphatically and completely miss the grounding to what's going on to that, right? And that's just a thing. But if you see a run toward deeper things, they could get into deeper water with deeper emotions connected to them, and then have a much harder path out.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, I was listening to a podcast, and I forgot the guy's name. He was a philosopher, a Christian, and the guy facilitating the podcast says, "What do you fear for the church in the future?" And he goes, "Easy." He goes, "Artificial intelligence." And I thought, I'm like, artificial intelligence? That's just like greater like programming strength for computers that can do, whatever.
Skynet.
And, oh my goodness. We see where it is already from when I heard that podcast. But I think the challenge for the church will be truth. Like, what is true in an age of advanced artificial intelligence? When we get to the point when someone can create on a video someone that is a clone to Shane Pennington, voice, mannerisms, everything, and he says this, did Shane really say it? And then how do you, and that's just one lame example, but it's moving so quickly that I think that's going to be a challenge for the church.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I talk about this a good bit with friends at work, right? Because we're always looking for applications. I see AI as another tool that no one really knows how they're going to use it yet. But some of the things we posited was we're going to have to start seeing things that are human certified, like true authenticated, created by a human. Right, because that's actually what will make things value still. I'm not going to go buy AI art when I know I could have done that myself. I still want someone's hand on it. There's authenticity there. Similarly to a sermon, I could see in a short 10 years the PCA General Assembly saying your sermons need to be certified made by a human, to what you're talking about. Think of how much remote preaching can go on, like, in some scenarios. COVID was a recent example, but you still have people that do live streams. You still have recordings and stuff. And the AI stuff from a language processing perspective is getting better. It still is not that great, but, it can be used as a tool, but it's still drawing on failed knowledge. The Spirit's not engaging with the tool necessarily. The tool could draw from good resources, but it's still not going through a human. Right. So unless you believe in, I don't, but like an age of spiritual machines, right, a singularity type of thing, I don't understand what that could ever mean in reality, and I don't think it'll happen. But human certification of things is going to become a thing. I don't see how it couldn't if we can mirror and replicate everything. With a robot,
which I think is a great opportunity for the church, right? I mean, and we'd probably do a whole podcast on AI, but I feel like already, we're just barely into this AI stuff, and I already have more of an appreciation for imperfection than ever. You know what I mean? And then some of that was already coming out of just music, right? Because even though it's not necessarily artificial intelligence, we already had artificial drum beats and artificial, the perfection of music through artificial means. And then you go back and you listen to Led Zeppelin, and you hear the imperfections of timing and drum beats and all those kinds of things, and you're like, oh,
you mean perfect imperfections?
Perfect imperfections, right? And And I'm already seeing myself like do that with AI, where you see a picture and you're like, that's AI, and I hate it, and it's perfect, and I hate perfection.
And I think that's the danger, and it's also the opportunity at the same time.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be so good, it's going to fool people. But as we were talking about this, I think about my own boys who were so enamored with Spotify and their playlists, and then it's like, oh, Dad, I don't even that's digital music. It's like, no, now we've got to go back to my time frame and buy an LP, and hear that, and they're talking about the sound difference, you know. But when that becomes realigned on the subject of what's true and what isn't, what has a human touch to it, you know, is what has, more importantly, a spiritual component, you know, through humanity, I think is of course in the end going to win out.
Yeah.
But I think artificial intelligence is, you know, one time we did a tour in Tulsa, and we're like, you know, in the 1920s, you know what was the most busy airport in the entire world? The Tulsa airport. And you think of the time frame from the Wright brothers to the 1920s, not that much time frame.
Yeah.
And yet flight had changed radically. Yeah. Tulsa was the busiest airport in the world, but soon, not much after that, we're going to the moon. We've got fighter jets that you wouldn't believe, you know, and I think AI is going to move in that direction.
I think one of my concerns is and it kind of touches on what you've already said, Zach, some of the things you've talked about, Peter, and I know C.S. Lewis has talked about this, and I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but it's that tasting but never like clenching, never biting down, never actually coming to a knowledge of the truth. You know what I mean? And I just feel like we could move into an age where everybody's, like you said, I think you're going to be able to have a conversation with anybody who's open to you having a conversation again, because we're so hate the censorship and the shutting down of conversations and all of that we've gone through, right? And so, and people are skeptical, people are looking for truth, but I think it could be a time where everybody's open to everything, but nobody really clinches or bites down on anything, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Where I think of the scripture, always learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth, right? I'm open to everything. I listen to all kinds of podcasts. You know, I believe everything's possible, right? And I wouldn't discredit anything, but I don't really take hold of anything, latch onto it, and live by it, you know. And that's kind of what I fear of the people in the world who are the Jordan Petersons, the Joe Rogans, the people that matter, people are listening to. That's kind of my fear for them, and it's a fear for a whole generation coming up, kind of following that.
Well, I just, even aside from this, I just read an article that's pretty interesting where it's talking about Christianity kind of working its way into podcasts like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Tucker Carlson. I mean, from both sides of the political spectrum, but faith is coming in that you wouldn't expect faith to be such a big deal on Joe Rogan. Yet look on his several last guests that he's interviewed, like Mel Gibson, who I don't know about Mel Gibson's faith, but I mean he talked about the death and the objective resurrection of Jesus Christ and what that means. And where's that going? It's going to all of Joe Rogan's followers.
Yeah.
I mean, God works in mysterious ways,
and
he never loses, you know.
And hopefully, like your public intellectuals, some of these guys really do finally clamp down on true truth, and hopefully it has a massive impact on our society. But we'll see.
Welcome to 2025, guys.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Play the Man podcast. Stay sturdy, friends.